Welcome back to the Occult Rejects. Today's going to be a special one. We're stepping into one of the deepest wells in Western thought, the world of Plato. And I don't mean the silly putty, and not just Plato the philosopher. You hear about it in school, but we hear about Plato the myth maker, the architect of metaphysics, the man whose writings shaped everything from Christianity to mysticism, esoteric philosophy, and the occult tradition that came much, much later. To help us unpack a little bit here, we've got two great, amazing, and brilliant guests with us today, P.D. Newman and Ike Baker. And this time, it's going to be heavy. We're talking about Plato's writings, the hidden layers inside of them, the big ideas like the forms, the soul, the nature of reality, and why texts like the Republic and the Timaeus still matter today as we're trying to understand the spiritual and the symbolic foundations of Western world as we know it. Plato isn't just ancient history. He's still in the room with us today. His fingerprints are all over everything: religion, philosophy, initiation systems, and the way people think about truth itself. So today, we're going back into the cave and hopefully coming back out with a little more light. PD, Ike, welcome back to the Occult Rejects. And I myself, do not forget, am Brandon Lee of Magus in the Media. After this, head over, subscribe, like, and share. The same thing you do with everybody else on this panel. We're going deep, and I'm sending it over to the head cardinal himself, the Nick, the Occult Reject himself. Head it over.
What is that? Funny. Oh, I love it. Thanks, Jules. Banger of an intro. Thank you so much, Brandon.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. I appreciate Ike coming here. I appreciate PD Newman coming on. Ike, I really appreciate you even setting this up. I mean, this is amazing for me. So thank you all. Yeah, you can check out the Occult Rejects, BitChute, Rumble, YouTube, all major podcasts. If you feel inclined to send money, we do sell T-shirts too for $25 a piece. You will get it delivered to your house. So if you're interested, hit me up on social media. And yeah, that is all. Let me introduce Judith. What is going on? How are you?
Hi, I'm the Loon. You can catch me on YouTube on as the Loon and on X. And I just do some self-care and some internal discussions. Thank you for having me.
No, of course. Thank you for joining. I always appreciate it. And my man, Jules, just saw you a few hours ago. What is going on, brother? Thank you for joining us again.
What's up, man? Thank you for having me, guys. Jules, host of the Gray Pill podcast, handsome Hierophant, Mississippi Mystic. Yeah, glad to be here. It's been a while since I've been on an Occult Rejects episode, so I'll probably keep my mouth shut for most of this one. I don't know much about Plato, but I am willing to learn. So Ike and PD, it's good to meet you guys. PD, I heard me and you have something in common, being from the same area maybe. So that's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah. I didn't know you're from Mississippi.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Mississippi Mystic. It's
what part?
Something that I've coined. But yeah, up in North Mississippi. Well, central to north, a little north of Jackson. So, okay. Yeah, man. But yeah, no, Nick, thanks for having me. And yeah, guys, follow me on X at Gray Pill Pod and go over to Patreon. Check us out over there. We do Gods of the Morning Wood every Saturday morning. Nick and Headless usually join us. And this morning we covered the Nag Hammadi text. We covered the sanctum. I really want to say sanctum rectum of the tarot, but sanctum something. I don't know. And then the Delphic Maxims. It was a banger, and it will be going private in a few hours. So go check it out after this if you want.
Thank you very much, Jules. I appreciate it.
Here. Stoked to see all my fellow rejects.
Hell yeah, brother. It's good to have you on. And Mr. Robbie Marks, the storyteller himself. What is going on, sir?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is going to be a fun one. I am R. Marks, artist, illustrator, and do a variety of research into various subject matters. I have the Metamindcast, which is my podcast, various interviews like this and stuff esoteric subjects that I cover. But if you want to check out all my miscellaneous links, you can go to my link tree, which is linktree RMARX. And I will say that over the last couple of years, I've pretty extensively been really digging into Plato. And I'm just completing laws right now. And so it's been quite the journey going through all this information. And I'm really interested to see kind of, where this whole conversation goes on just Platonic, philosophy, the governmental processes, the various gods and goddesses and temples, and it's just some really it's stuff that I really enjoy, and I appreciate you having me on, Nick.
Of course, Robbie, you're always a pleasure to have on the show. And we got Eros. What is up, Eros? Good to have you back.
Yeah, I'm thank you, and thanks for having me on. I'm so excited for this one today. Plato was the first to create this unified ethical cosmology, and he coined the term demiurge and the ideal forms, and was the first to talk about Atlantis. There's just so much that could be said about Plato. It's like how we're not going to be able to cover much, I'm sure, but very excited. You can find me on X at Eros to Ethos, and you can find me on YouTube at Erosub.
Thank you very, very much for coming on, Eros. And Ethan Indigo, what is going on, sir?
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Brandon, dope introduction. PD, Ike, I'm really excited to speak with you guys. And like many of the things that I look into, Plato makes me feel more ignorant the more I study and learn of him, right? It's just such a deep stream of information. So Ethan Indigo Smith, I'm easy to find on all the social media, and I always appreciate people reaching out and communicating, and bunch of writing out there and articles and books. And again, appreciate everybody.
Appreciate you making it, Ethan. And finally, to the guest, Ike, please, sir. People don't know who you are already. Let's remind them. Where can they find all your amazing work?
I will be moonlighting at Chuck E. Cheese for the next month and a half. If you guys want to come down, it's over here just outside of Charlotte. They told me that I can't bring a full-size guitar. I have to bring a ukulele. So my name's Ike Baker. It's a pleasure to be here amongst such excellent company. I host the Arcanum podcast and YouTube channel, ARCANVM. And I wrote a bunch of books, and I primarily, I guess most people will know me as Golden Dawn magician. That's kind of my background. I was on this channel with Frater RC just a little while ago talking about the Golden Dawn. It was a great conversation. But Platonism is something that's very, very near and dear to me. I got my first 4 Platonic dialogues. My dad bought it for me, and he gifted it to me when I was about 11 years old. And it was called 4 Great Dialogues. I think it was the Phaedo, the Apology, the Crito, and I'm forgetting the 4th one. But so it started really early for me, and I didn't have any kind of academic filter that was trying to, fit me into this little nice, rationally square box that academia was trying to filter our perception of the Platonic dialogues through for a really long time. So these always came across as mystical texts to me, and I actually bonded for the first time. I had PD on my podcast a number of years ago, and and I think we might have used exactly these words in the podcast. What he was putting down, I was picking up, because this immediately to me was a kindred spirit. PD is one of the finest Platonists I've ever met my entire life. And he's an incredible author, and his book, Theurgy, Theory, and Practice, it just blew the doors off. And you know what? It's saying something when you get an author who writes it's a relatively short treatise. If you've seen literature on Platonism and theory, it's like, you know, but more information, more valuable information, and more heart in that thin volume than arguably probably the last 40 books I read on Platonism. So of course I jumped at the opportunity to bring him on this show today. And so thanks for being here, man.
Man, thank you. And you are far too generous. But that book came about in a very strange way. I told you a little bit about it. You know, for those of you who aren't familiar with my research and how it started, I mainly focus on psychedelics and the use of psychedelics within ritual contexts, indigenous settings, and especially religious uses in ancient religions. But in my teens, I got really involved in ceremonial magic, and just like Ike, you know, the first kind of the most visible system was the Golden Dawn system. I spent a lot of time in the Golden Dawn system, got into Crowley for a little while, especially because of his validation of the use of entheogens within a magical context, which was the first validation I had seen of what I was experiencing in my own path. But what got me into Platonism and what led to the writing of theurgy, believe it or not, I read this book by August Uzdavinis. He passed away in 2010, probably the most brilliant author I've ever read, next to somebody like Peter Kingsley. And that book absolutely set me on fire. And I didn't know that August had passed away. I didn't know who this man was. And I had no intentions of writing a book on theurgy. But one night, I'm dead asleep, and I have an encounter with what I can only call Uzdavinis' ghost. Comes to me in my sleep and gives me this book, fully formed, the entire organization of it, the structure of it, each chapter, the themes. And I woke up 2-3 in the morning with this fully formed book in my head, and I thought, how the fuck does that happen? Where did that come from? But I didn't do anything about it. And successively, for roughly 90 days, he would startle me awake about the same time, 2 or 3 in the morning, and make me write. And every book I wrote before that book, you know, you can probably confirm this. It takes about a year, you know, to research and write a book. This book happened in 90 days. I wrote it in an absolute fever, in a half trance state, in the middle of the night, being prodded by this ornery Lithuanian fucking ghost. So I say that because I don't take full credit for that book. I also am not trying to say it's a channeled work, but it came about in a very strange way, and it was by far the oddest 90 days of my entire career as a writer. So strange stuff.
The muse.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh, and just a selfless plug. If people want to hear more about his book on theurgy and Ike Baker's etheric magic, you can go check out the Occult Rejects. We have episodes on both. So, I don't know. I don't know who wants to start it off first with Plato. I mean, I don't know. I was thinking about asking Pete if you don't mind. I guess like where I don't even know where to start. I guess when it comes to Plato, in I guess occult or esoteric system, where do you see like, I guess like the most blatant, I guess borrowing from his ideas, his influence?
Who are we asking?
I guess really, I'll ask you first if you don't mind.
Okay. Everywhere. If it's a Western system of attainment, Plato is in the background somewhere, even if the author of that system isn't aware of the fact. So many tropes that we take for granted in Western mystery traditions, Western mysticism, have their origin in either Plato or in what Plato was reading. And that's especially true of someone like Parmenides, Pythagoras, Empedocles, Heraclitus, all of these early pre-Socratic voices. He addresses them and their ideas, even if he's not clear about it, even if he's not saying, we're commenting on or building on what came in the past. In a big way, he gives his reader the benefit of the doubt that they already know this stuff. And at the time, they probably did. Within the academy, they certainly would have been familiar with those texts. But yeah, everything. And it's especially true of early Christianity, of Orthodox Christianity. And it's true of heterodox Christianity and Gnosticism. But when you see the emergence of Christianity proper in the Orthodox Church, in figures like Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Athanasius, it's a Maximus the Confessor, especially. It's impossible to make sense of what they're saying without recourse to Plato. Like Egg said, without a filter in there that you can say, oh, this is Plato just recast for a different type of audience. And what's really different about that audience in Platonism, the monad is transcendent, a lot like the Father in Christianity, right? And in Judaism, the Father is separate from his creation. Christianity, drawing from not necessarily Plato, but certainly the Neoplatonists, realized the gap that creates because there is a philosophical need to maintain God's immanence within the creation. And the Neoplatonists solved this problem by what they call synthemata and symbola, which are tokens and symbols. But tokens are so you can think about them similar to how the Golden Dawn has correspondences. When you look at the Tree of Life, each Sephira, each Neteva, they each have a string of correspondences. But in a lot of approaches to that, it becomes a psychological mnemonic where you'll see practitioners saying things like, well, if I surround myself with things that are red, in increments of 5 and iron, that I'm propelling my consciousness into Gebura, because all of these are psychological mnemonics that entrance me to think about Mars, to think about Gebura. But what's different about the way the Neoplatonists think about these tokens are that they don't represent the gods. They are the gods in fractal microcosmic form. So when you interact with iron, you are interacting with Mars, only simply the way Mars manifests on this plane. So Christianity takes this and transfers all of that into the figure of Christ. Christ becomes the immanence of God within this creation. But that couldn't have happened without Plato. I like to say that Christ was born and crucified in a Platonic cosmos, in particularly a Hellenistic cosmos. And the best example of that is in the Creed, where it says that Christ descends to Hades, right, to release the saints. Well, that means he descended to a Greek underworld, right? So in the same motion, it confirms the Greek cosmoconception, but it also overturns it in that for the first time, people can get out of Hades and into heaven, which for them would have been Mount Olympus, where men don't go. Men aren't allowed there. But Christ confirms it and overturns it. So no Plato, no Christ.
Here, here. Yeah, absolutely. I you know, like people will get confused when I tell them that I'm a Christian. I was like, wait, hold on, you're a magician too? You claim to do the Golden Dawn? It's like, yeah, first of all, you know, there's definitely some sort of, it's not necessarily the person's fault per se, but you know, exoteric discussions about religion always devolve upon the same issues, which is a definition of terms. People will use terms generically according to their own sort of, you know, referencing themselves and what they know. That's kind of like if you say, hey, can you get me a Band-Aid out of the cabinet? What you're talking about is a bandage. Band-Aid is a brand, but you're using that term generically without even thinking about it. And people do that with Christianity. I am in terms of my faith, my outlook on the world, I would say that I'm somewhat a little bit more pre-Nicene contemplative Christian. Also, you know, I practice and administer the 7 sacraments. Even though I'm not Orthodox technically, I'm Orthoprax. So I'll practice those rituals according to the Roman rite or the Coptic rite. And then I'll say, look, my metaphysic, hell, even my theology is Platonic. You know, the early church, I mean, you look at any reading. Augustine's the obvious one, but if you look at even like the Desert Fathers, they're using this is true of the Hermetica as well. We like to, for what I believe, like reasons of political correctness in the modern day, we like to attribute the Hermetic text specifically to the Egyptians, but in reality, there's no Hermetic text that predates the Platonic dialogues. And not only it's written in Greek and Coptic is mostly Greek in terms of the alphabet, and they're using discrete Platonic terms in context. Words like psyche, right? Soul, nous, higher consciousness, logos, these kinds of things, using those Platonic terms in that specific Platonic context. It's the same thing in the writings of the Desert Fathers. When they talk about, I mean, Evagrius of Pontus, who was the great, you know, taxonomist of early Christian demonology, he talks about the soul having 3 parts. Okay, we first see that in the Phaedo, the Platonic dialogue. He's talking the tripartite nature of the soul, and he's talking about how he came out here in the desert so he could raise his consciousness up out of the appetitive, which is the lowest part, and into the rational, the logistikon, you know. So there, as PD rightly points out, I mean, it is so diffuse. We're only like, the modern commentators, specifically through esotericism, and what I would say adjacent to academia, this is the first time I'm seeing in a very long time commentators that are looking at this stuff and realizing just how significant it is. And we're beginning to, I see a movement now in the modern day of people starting to interpret this stuff, not in this very sterile, you know, let's put this thing in a glass case and put a little light on it, like, but interpreting it from almost from a position within the tradition. You know, so it's almost like we have a new Neoplatonism here that's working. I mean, that's what the old commentators were doing, you know, and somebody mentioned that they felt ignorant by reading Plato. And I mean, even the early Neoplatonists talk about that, you know, you know, so it's quite interesting. But I would say that to sort of piggyback on what PD said about Parmenides and Heraclitus, there was so pre-Socratic philosophy in the main, right? I'm going to break with this generalization to show you the exceptions, but in the main was not really that interested in a sophisticated theology. They were they were early sort of proto-physicists, natural philosophers. And that would have been what was going on in the Egyptian temple complexes, right? Because the gods were forces of nature, and each particular, you know, hieratic station or cultus was dedicated not only to working with the god, but understanding its functions in nature. Okay, so then this stuff gets taught to the Greeks. We know that. We don't have to go over that. It's well established that they went there to learn this shit, and they came back wizards. But a lot of guys were more interested in ethics, more interested in, are things relative, and the Heraclitus and things like this. Not Parmenides, Protagoras, things like that. And Plato addresses these in turn throughout his dialogues. He's constantly trying to, what I think he's orienting those pre-Socratic philosophies in the light of the Socratic movement, which is, but to PD's point, he's not being so heavy-handed about it, right? Because at the end of most of the Platonic dialogues, we're like, okay, we just spent 45 pages and we don't know where we are anymore. There's not like he never wraps a bow on it. He's the eternal cliffhanger.
Right.
But there is an exception. There's an exception. And those exceptions, the way that I see them through my research is Pherecydes, the ancient Orphic mythographer, who was, according to Diogenes Laertius, was the teacher of Pythagoras, who we all know, the great metaphysician and number mystic. And then Parmenides. And Parmenides, I believe it is said that at one point he was a Pythagorean, and he left that cult specifically for a new teacher who taught him the art of silence. And PD talks some about that in his book. So what you get in Plato really is a focus on metaphysic, an ethical imperative to using the mind to reach metaphysical heights, not necessarily just epistemological, but to get above that discursive weather, the way a plane has to get above the clouds in a storm. So to me, Plato is a continuation of those ancient pre-Socratic metaphysicians, right? And you see that in something like the curriculum of Iamblichus, the 12 Platonic dialogues that were in the late academy, they were requisite before practicing theurgy. There are 2 dialogues, and I believe that they're termed this according to either Olympiodorus of Alexandria or the anonymous Prolegomena, and Denny could probably tell me which one is which. But the Timaeus and the Parmenides, which are very, very, very cosmological, metaphysical, very abstract. They're considered, right? They're the final 2. They're 11 and 12 out of 12. You reach those last before you become a theurgist. But these are referred to as the dialogues beyond philosophy. Okay, and it's very, very important, right? You have Parmenides right there. Not only that, but if you go back to the epistemological tetrad of the Cratylus, the Theaetetus, the Sophist, and the Statesman, Socrates says, Parmenides taught me the dialectic when I was a kid. And then in the Parmenides, that final, series finale of the Iamblichian curriculum, it's the retelling of the story between Parmenides, his student Zeno, and the young Socrates. As a matter of fact, in the epistemological tetrad, Socrates hands the mic over to somebody who we call the Eleatic stranger, Xenon, the Eleatic foreigner, who then asks questions of a younger person named Socrates, who's not Socrates. So there's a lot of this coding and a lot of this layering in there to point who the forebears of this tradition really are. And then, of course, the Timaeus, whether you believe it's misattributed to Timaeus of Locri or not, it's an anachronistic sort of attribution. Whether you believe in the historicity or not, it is so clearly Pythagorean. So at least, as far as what we know about the cult. So yeah, all of that stuff ends up becoming one way or the other, particularly, and this is the point I tried to make, and I'll end here. The point I tried to make in writing my first book, A Formless Fire, was to show the trajectory of how we come to custodianship of these capital M mysteries. And it is through the initiatory societies that took place, obviously in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. They were going based off of, they were not necessarily just doing money magic and goetic conjuration. They were interested in theurgy. The Golden Dawn specifically states in a series of documents called the Flying Rolls, which are foundational to the Inner Order, you've come here to do theurgy, whether you realize it or not. Theurgy is the purpose of this. And then sprinkled throughout their rituals, which you really gotta listen to understand, are two things: the Christian New Testament, really the Gospels, and Neoplatonic literature. There are sayings from Proclus in the Neophyte ritual. So it's very, very that is, to me, that is the real tradition for me. And you get things like the grimoire tradition outside of academia or clerical custodianship, and given to us sort of egalitarianized through people like Mathers and Crowley, who came right out of and put these things in our hands, came right out of the society, these initiatory societies. So with that, I'm going to shut up and hand it back to PD and refill my coffee. I'll be back in 2 seconds.
No, he's absolutely right. So I agree with everything that he said.
I'll ask a question if you don't mind. This is sort of for Ike, but maybe for P. Would you also say that you're a Christian, PD?
That's an interesting question. So I was baptized into the Orthodox Church, and I am absolutely smitten with the Divine Liturgy as probably the most well-preserved theurgic ritual available, through the practice of theophagy, of God eating. It spells out in symbolic form exactly how these tokens work, and how engaging with them in a proper context has the ability to awaken their corresponding logoi within the soul. And I think the Divine Liturgy is it really is something special. That being said, there are so many heretical bones in my body that I mean, I can't just say I'm an Orthodox Christian, because so much of the lens through which I view the ongoings of the liturgical cycle is colored by people like Origen and Clement of Alexandria. And while they are incredibly important figures, the church has kind of whitewashed them. Let's get them out of here. They're not saints. We don't recognize them. And there was this, I forget his name. He's a theologian, an Orthodox theologian, but he was describing the role that Origen played in the early church. And he basically says that, we've got the church fathers and they're playing soccer and they're enjoying playing soccer. And Origen enters the picture, runs on the field. He says, I'm going to play, but he picks up the ball and runs off with it. And in the process creates football instead of soccer. And so the church fathers get pissed and kick him off the team. Then once he's out of the picture, they all continue playing football. And that's so real to the program and what kind of an influence those two figures had. But at the same time, if you say that out loud within a proper Orthodox setting, you're going to get labeled heterodox and probably be requested to take some counseling.
I guess the reason that I ask is you both mentioned Christianity and Jesus, and to me a big difference between Platonism and Christianity or the Abrahamic religion kind of pre-Neoplatonism is like, you know, it was sacrificial. It was a very sacrificial religion, which Neoplatonism and Platonism doesn't really encourage or incorporate at all. And so to me, it's like, is Jesus a way of incorporating morality and ethics into the Bible, and also synthesizing it with that tradition that is more sacrificial? I guess I wonder what you guys would think about that.
I got a short answer, and then I want to hear what Ike has to say about that. I would wholly disagree about Neoplatonism not being sacrificial. We see that in someone like Porphyry, who is against the sacrificing of animals and has adopted this very early Christian idea that what's being sacrificed to are demons. And in Platonism, demons do not exist. It's not a dualistic cosmos. There is the good, and everything stems from the good. There is no evil. There is privation of the good. But what privation of the good is a tendency to act in a way as though non-being were real. But as Parmenides tells us, non-being by definition cannot be. So it's a tendency to act in a way that is self-defeating because it's impossible. It's a physical lie, right? Demons are demonized daemons, and it's important to keep in mind. And when we get to someone like Iamblichus, he's very clear about the necessity of sacrifice. He's Syrian and fully immersed in the Syrian religious tradition. He espouses the traditional Hellenistic picture where everyone sacrifices at the temple. And it's through this act of sacrifice, because these animals are tokens of the gods. And just like Ike said, they get this from the Egyptians. Thales goes to Egypt, Plato goes to Egypt, Pythagoras goes to Egypt. When an Egyptian looked out on the Nile and saw an ibis, they didn't think, oh, that bird is sacred to Thoth or Tahuti. They said, there's Tahuti. It's a very different worldview, and it demands a lot of us because all of the sudden, everything we do is sacred. The secular does not exist, right? So when they take an animal, they're taking the god and sacrificing it. And within the Greek tradition, the sacrifice is not complete until you partake of it. So unlike with the Jewish tradition, where they would burn the entire animal and leave it on the altar, to legitimize a sacrifice in Hellenistic tradition, you have to partake of it. And that's the origin of this theophagy, of consuming the god to become the god. Once you consume it, you're possessed by it. And ever since William Blatty wrote the psyop that is The Exorcist, we've got this bad idea in America of possession, that possession is bad. But possession in the Greek tradition, especially in Neoplatonism, that's the highest grace we can be afforded. It demands that we completely reorientate our view of this. And what was the second thing you said after sacrifice?
Morality.
Jesus. Morality.
Injected into the Israelite
I would say that.
Oh yes.
I would say Jesus completely disrupts the Torah, disrupts Mosaic law. Because he says in the Apostolic Creed, for instance, when they're talking about allowing Gentiles to be Christians, the big question is, well, do they have to cut off their foreskin? If they're going to be Christians, shouldn't they be circumcised? And the answer is no, because Christianity is not bound by the Abrahamic covenant. Gentiles do not have to be circumcised to be Christians. That in itself completely disrupts any continuity between Judaism and Christianity, so much so that So of someone like Valentinus, I think it is perfectly his desire to remove the Old Testament altogether is warranted, because that's not what they're practicing anymore. Okay, that's all I got.
Circumcision is also a psyop, so there's that. Go on, Ike.
100%.
Go.
I think that's beautifully put. What I would add, I would just reinforce that point of, you look at it this way, right? In the old kingdom of Egypt, when we begin to start seeing the pyramid texts, okay, where do we get these? Right, that's where we get the stuff like the Book of the Dead and the Book of the Gates and all this stuff. These are from the funerary carvings, the hieroglyphics inside the tombs and the mortuary complexes of the pharaoh. Okay, it was believed that the pharaoh was the only one who got to meet and identify with Osiris, bring light to the underworld like Ra, and push back Apep, the serpent of oblivion, like Set. Set is the one who does that in the underworld, believe it or not. Of course, they have to incorporate the god of violence to push back annihilation. Then later in the second intermediate period, you start seeing the coffin text. They're a little bit more democratic about it and say, okay, well, if you guys can pay us, then you'll have souls too. And you can afford for us to carve this shit on the inside of your tomb. Now, then you get the Hebrew covenant, which, obviously says over and it's self admittedly refers to a chosen people. You get the New Testament, somebody who comes out of this chosen people and says immortality is for fucking everyone.
Right.
Okay. You must, but this is what it is. That's how you become God. It's the reason for theophagia. In my opinion, what he does is what Jesus does at the Last Supper is a baptism of the old gods. He takes them down from a place, right? Dionysus is very difficult to understand. Why is he difficult to understand? He's very similar to Christ, similar, theophagic sort of thing with the wine and things like this. He's difficult on this because that's a difficult thing for us to understand about ourselves. How is it that with one glass or two glasses, I can be sitting there and me and PD can be, just having this incredible time full of joy and ebullience, and then on another night I can have the same amount of alcohol and be vomiting or falling down the stairs and things like. Yeah, you become the Maenad versus the exalted, god of wine. It's a very difficult thing there in the ancient world where they were still really, really wrestling by the strict bonds of their mortality. So when Christ comes, he addresses this stuff. He talks about the Mosaic law, and you'll find in the Gospels, he says, he'll make a pronouncement to his disciples. He'll say, you have heard it said, A, B, and C. And A, B, and C is some variant of the Mosaic law. And then he'll go on to say, but verily, truly, I say unto you, X, Y, and Z. And X, Y, and Z will directly contradict A, B, and C. And so there's this defense in Orthodox Christianity to say, well, yeah, but he says I didn't come to break the law. Yes, that's right. He says I came not to break, and the typical translation is to fulfill the law. Now, what does that do, right? In this archaic English, it's very, very like that. It's that Band-Aid thing that we're talking about again. People are defining it on their own terms. What the Greek word is there is plerosai, and it's related to the word pleroma, fullness. He says, I came not to destroy, but to complete the law, to make it whole. Immortality is for everyone. Now, there's some stuff where he talks about if you choose the path of separateness, if you choose that, then you will go to a place where there is much pain and the gnashing of teeth. But it doesn't say, it says you're going to go somewhere. You're not going to die and be in the ground and it's over. Immortality is for every soul. It's just how do you want to spend it based on what you do here? And that is extremely Platonic. That's all you get that all the way in the Phaedo, the afterlife myth in the Phaedo. You get it in the myth of Fuck you. If you go to the Osirian at Abydos right now, and you go through the procession way. I was there in October and I took pictures. On the right-hand side is the Amduat. Okay. This was written like 4,000 years ago on that wall. Okay. On the left side are the Book of Gates. In the Amduat, the book Amduat means what is in the Duat, what is in the afterlife. Okay. At the highest, it's kind of like this vertical triptych. At the highest point near the ceiling, there are the blessed dead. And they get to participate with Ra and his solar bark, and they pull him very gratefully through the night of the underworld. They get to participate in that. In the middle are people who live decent lives, and they go to kind of like the field of reeds, and they live what life was like here, kind of. And then on the bottom of the wall, near the floor, there are people who are hung upside down with their arms tied behind their back. And they're the only figures on either wall that are completely painted red. For burning, for pain, so this idea that hell is Christian, or specifically Judeo-Christian, is bullshit. Very convenient bullshit. But this stuff is way predates that stuff. So he's coming to talk about here's the way out. Here is the way out. And I'm going to leave it on this. If anybody wants to understand a little bit more of this through maybe like a Christian Kabbalistic lens, Renaissance Kabbalistic lens, look at the work of Johannes Reuchlin, particularly De Verbo Mirifico, the wonder-working word. He shows how the old dispensation was the tetragrammaton, the four-lettered name of God, and how the new dispensation is the pentagrammaton, with the insertion of the shin of spirit in the middle of that old name, Yahweh, becoming Yeshua. It's a little anachronistic because we don't have Jesus's name written anywhere in Hebrew. It's in Greek, and it's Jesus. But I think that the idea is really relevant and very important. And I don't think any of this, whether you believe it happened or not, it doesn't matter to me. The truth is what matters to me, not the historical truth, but the capital T truths underlying that thing is what's important to me. And I think whether you believe Christ existed or now is symbolic, you could not have Christianity, those ideas, come to the fullest without Platonism. It all starts with Plato. You know, at least in the historical record, there may very well have been people before him. We don't know about them, and they didn't leave anything. So,
I want to make a little. I want to take us back like 300 years from Christ back to Plato, and then even before then, because I think it's really important for the audience who don't know much about Plato for us to break down why the immortality of the soul is so important in Plato and where that even comes from. When we hit before Pythagoras and into more of the Orphic mysteries and how important it was, and that lineage from Orphism to Pythagoreanism to the Socrates and his dialectic in getting into the Platonic dialogues and Plato himself, because Plato talks about what metempsychosis is and the transmigration of the soul and how important that is to understanding what even immortality is and why the Platonic forms are so important in Plato's dialogues to begin with. Because when we're understanding that the Orphic mysteries are a mythic mystery of, Orpheus trying to bring his love, Eurydice, up from the cave, up from Hades, up from the underworld. And he doesn't have enough faith to not look back as she disappears. And then he pines on into existence of his Eros forever. And then from there, we move forth to Pythagoreanism, where we get the ideas of the mathematic and the harmony of the spheres. And so we're taking it from the mythic into the more pre-scientific understanding of how to build up a mystery school and how to bring people into understanding that divine spheres and the geometries, which then Plato, which Ike in your classes you very well described, has taken Pythagorean his understanding of the harmony of the spheres and put it into his very work in a very coded way. And from there, we understand that Socrates is trying to now retrain the mind from the mythic into the dialectic and teach people how to philosophize, which is why we don't ever get anything wrapped up into a tight bow. And then through there, we can understand what is the transmigration of the soul? What does it mean to be immortal? And how do we take what we're trying to then talk about with the Christos, with our Golden Dawn, with our magical practices, and what theurgia is? What is the divine working of trying to have that anagogic experience of bringing ourselves up into the heavens or the forms or into the divine, or as Iamblichus would want us to do, is bring the divine down into this world so we can have an embodied experience? Because I think that's what Socrates is truly trying to talk about in Plato's works, especially the Republic, especially the Phaedrus, where he is actually, Socrates' god is Apollo. And if we want to map that to the Tree of Life, we can map Apollo to Tippereth, which then is bringing us back to Christ, where from Kether down, you get Socrates speaking from his Apollonian way of trying to truly break things down in that well-organized symphonic style of speech. And then that reincarnation that we're talking about with the metempsychosis and the transmigration of the soul is that ascent into the forms. And that forms is every time we die and are reborn, that metempsychosis, that cyclical nature of the soul trying to reach its highest state of the philosopher king. I think that's really telling of what is our path as magicians and what are we truly trying to do here, which is trying to reach that divine state and reach that spark that's within us and get rid of that leaden soul, that alchemizing of our soul. And what he's doing every time, especially in the Republic, every person he talks to, Plato's brothers, which is Glaucon and Theaetetus or whoever the guy with the T name, and everybody else is taking a certain position as Socrates is like, no, this is how we're going to start philosophizing here. And we're going to start laying out the direct understanding of what is justice and how do we live a just life. And to live that just life is trying to understand how to transcend our current state, which is what I believe PD and Ike is talking about here, is how do we live that path of the Christos or the Apollonian, or how do we truly understand how to philosophize? How do we live the magical life, which is that are unifying ourselves with the forms, or walking out of the cave. And so that's kind of I want to take us back into Plato itself, because I think that's really important to lay the foundations of what is the Western esoteric tradition. It is nothing without Plato. And Christianity is nothing without Plato, because Christianity is laying itself the foundation of Aristotelianism and what Thomas Aquinas did. So without Plato, you don't have Aristotle. You don't have Aristotle was known as the mind of the academy. And so you get the mind and the light, right? The mind being Aristotle and the light being Plato, and you put that together, and Christianity would be nothing and wouldn't exist today without the very foundation and the bedrock of the Western philosophical tradition. So that's
and I don't look at it too strictly historical in terms of the way you might look at an organism evolving biologically, so much as I look at the telos, and I look at it less like evolution and more like growing up from a child into maturity. That's how I see the history, and I see a telos, a teleology behind it, meaning a metaphysical purpose, purpose behind it. So I think that really Platonism, it was an early form of Christianity attempting to be like what. I'll put it this way. Forget the label. What Christianity actually was when it was first happening. Okay, that's it in the world, the Christ event. Let's just call it that. Platonism was, for me, that trying to be born into the world. And what do you have? You see a guy named Socrates who's running around telling everybody to walk away from the wisdom of the world. Walk away from worldly wisdom. What happened? They killed him for it. Well, actually, they gave him a choice. Same way Christ kind of had a choice. They said you can either leave, you can be exiled, or you die. And he said, fuck you, kill me. And it's that willingness to go to his death for the right reasons is ultimately where we are all headed if we are doing theurgic initiatory magic. I want to hear from PD though. What do you think?
Well, my first thought is in regard to what you said, Brandon, taking it back, and what that immediately made me think of what was the organic, gradual development of this idea of a soul and eventual movement into metempsychosis, and how even that model became kind of allegorized once we get into the Stoics and the Neoplatonists. But the picture of the soul in the earliest literature, in Homer, the soul is like an echo, like a dim shade, a reflection of what we are as a living being, right? But somehow, somewhere, probably from the north, Dodds proposes it could be the Scythians or the Thracians, which constitutes that Hyperborea, that north beyond the north. Kingsley gets into Mongolians, Tibetans, Siberian shamans, but somehow this idea of the soul, not as a shade of the self, but as the very locus of one's emotional and intellectual life, enters the picture. And seemingly out of nowhere, we get figures like Hermontimus, Epimenides, Aristeas, these figures that long before somebody like Robert Monroe comes along and talks about out-of-body experiences, we've got these three poet philosophers leaving their body, lying as though dead, much like we see with Parmenides and how his teacher taught him, like Ike said, stillness, hesychia, which is actually where we get the term for hesychasm in Orthodoxy, their ritual practice of monks, not lay persons, but lying as though dead and their souls leaving their body. But they're traveling horizontally at this point. They're traveling around the place where they already live. So they're going to other cities and reporting what they see back. It isn't until we get to someone like Parmenides where all of a sudden we get vertical soul travel, where he's going down into the underworld, meeting with the goddess there and acquiring laws. But it's a very gradual transition of this idea of soul movement, But by the time Plato enters the picture, this is one reason I think in the Parmenides why he says, if we're going to do this, we have to kill Father Parmenides. What does he mean by that? Well, his program is essentially reorientating soul flight and saying, just like Christ did when he overturned the Greek cosmoconception, he's saying Hades is right here. We're in it. He allegorizes the underworld and says we are at the bottom of the chain of being. There's no further down you can go, which means soul flight reorientates, and now we go up. We ascend and we get to unite with the gods. And all of this is what this gradual development of what the soul is, looks like, and does feeds into Christianity and changes it. And when Christ says, like at the Last Supper, like Ike was talking about a moment ago, when he says, "This do in remembrance of me," the word he uses for remembrance is a conjugation of anamnesis. And any educated spectator that would have heard him say that would have immediately thought, oh, he's talking about Plato. He's saying that what we're about to do is going to make us remember the divine origins, the divine nature of our soul. He's talking about our soul, So that's what first came to my mind.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's great. I find it interesting how this conversation so quickly moved to Christianity, especially and I get why it did, and I'm totally fine with that. I blame me too. Thank you, PD. But why I say that is because the Neoplatonists were being killed off at droves by Christians in that time frame. So it's really fascinating how then the exoteric to the esoteric is so dichotomized, and how it can be so misstrued, the allegory of a cave itself. It seems like the exoteric Christians never made it out of the cave, and the esoteric Christians, which I have considered myself at times, and I guess I don't know if I would anymore, but it's such a fascinating conversation, this level of remembrance, because Christianity itself, I do think, and I can actually blame my schooling for this, because I studied Platonism and I have a degree in philosophy. And so I my brain structures it slightly different than maybe yourself, Ike, because of you were raised differently. But it's such a fascinating conversation how it moves itself forward. And so, what do you think about that, and why?
Here's the thing, man. I mean, you read the Republic, and it starts off basically, but Glaucon and et alia, they're asking Socrates, they're pushing him a little bit, right? It's a normal conversation, like a typical thing, but they're pushing him to say, like, okay, let's talk about the philosopher king. Let's talk about the best possible civilization, the state of the best governance of the polis. Really, it's not just talking about the external polis. It's talking about the internal polis.
Exactly.
Yeah, of course.
That's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
But what he basically says, if you listen to it, if you read it, he kind of basically puts it in a way where it's like, look, the best of all possible situations is an agrarian sort of small thing, tribal thing almost. And then they kind of push him for like, okay, well, what about war? And it's like, okay, if you want to go that route, well, now here's this kind of like eugenics hellscape that he just lays out. It's like anything that human beings do, anything that we're going to do will inevitably or really indelibly be imprinted with our highest potentials and also our lows. And I think one of the things that you find a lot in Platonism in particular was a railing against worldly institutions, right? Plato talks about it in his 7th letter, which is one of the coolest pieces of Platonism. And it's the one that I think, and Daniel, tell me if I'm wrong, that most scholars agree out of all the letters is most likely authentic. So Plato's talking about how he basically gives us right there the scheme of like why he's always talking about politics and putting in an ethical imperative on being wise, right? Because he basically says, if you are not wise and you're in charge of governing people, you can do a lot of harm. Okay, so there's an ethical imperative tied to philosophy, and he talks about how he don't forget he lived. Right, this was a golden age of Greece, but he lived during the time of the 40 tyrants. Okay, that was like Gestapo shit. They're pulling people out of their house at night and they're disappearing. And meantime, some of those people were his relatives. So he says in his 2nd letter, he's like, or a 7th letter, I was poised for a life in politics and I walked away. I said, I'm going into philosophy. And then, for anybody that's interested in really getting inside his history, I would recommend reading the 7th letter as well. But I think that's really what we're talking about here. When you look at like any organization is capable of atrocities, but it's usually the smaller, and at the beginning period, it's very, very, I would say that's when it's probably most pure. But at the end of the day, like nothing's really ever at its beginning period. We're all evolving out of something else. And, I think I could go on about the Neoplatonic stuff, but I feel like I'm beating a dead horse. So maybe I'll hear from PD.
Well, you mentioned the 7th letter and its legitimacy, and beyond the testimonials, it's really the best source for clear evidence of what the Tübingen school calls the unwritten doctrines. That there is this, as esoteric as Plato's dialogues are, there is an esoteric component that was taught only within the academy. And we really get the best picture of that from the 7th letter. And it lines up a lot with the Parmenides, because, Plato, there's so much emphasis placed on the forms, but even in the Parmenides, he allows himself to doubt the existence of the forms. But what comes in place of that isn't really spelled out until the 7th letter, and it's what is referred to as the principles. And it's a lot like with Empedocles. Empedocles has his 4 roots, which are the source of our elements in the West. Now, in modern magical traditions, it's often juxtaposed against the planets. The planets are up there, the elements are down here. For Empedocles, that wasn't the case. his roots are very similar to Plato's forms. He identifies them with gods. Fire is Zeus, and water is Persephone. Hera is air. So they're not the elements as the building blocks of the world in kind of the way the atomists might have thought about it, even though they weren't thinking in terms of elements. But in addition to these four ruling roots, you have two factors, love and strife, that are constantly pushing and pulling the world apart. When love rules, everything comes together, and what we get is something like the Parmenidean one, right? There's no space with Parmenides. Everything is one and changes. But when strife rules, we enter a picture more akin to Heraclitus's cosmos, where everything is change. Everything is kind of being pushed apart and expelling each other. Well, with the seventh letter, we get the first peek at these unwritten doctrines, which are essentially Pythagorean, his paras and apeiron, which is limit and limitlessness. Limit being akin to the monad, the one, the Parmenidean idea, and then limitlessness being what has been called the indefinite dyad, I think is what Aristotle calls it in his testimonial. The indefinite dyad, which is the source of all multiplicity. And so what we're really looking at is similar to Olympiodorus's reading of the story of Zagreus, of Dionysus Zagreus, when he's ripped apart by the Titans. Zagreus represents Paros, limit. He's one, the one, but the Titans, who Olympiodorus says, because of the T in Titan, the TI, which means in Greek something specific, something separate. So separateness rips the one apart and dismembers the one, and now we get the indefinite dyad that creates complete multiplicity in the world. And I don't want to go too far off into that, because it's a deep wade, but to Ike's point, yes, that alone is enough to make the seventh letter more valid than the rest of them.
Yeah, and it's, if you look at the Pythagorean upsilon, right, which would look like our Y, our letter Y. This is this sort of triform crossroads this was a pedagogical sort of device, a symbolic kind of device for teaching the right or the left path. Okay, particularly in Pythagoreanism, and we can liken these to like the path of return and the path of separateness, which have to do, on the one hand, the path of separateness is selfishness, right? Because we're constantly identifying with self rather than all the end, the one, right? And then the other one is sacrifice, which we're constantly working for the one. And so I don't know how like technical I should get, but this idea that Proclus talks about, this reversion of all cycles revert upon themselves. And that's what the Pythagorean question is kind of trying to answer, is like, in this reversion, do we stop and revert towards the one, or do we see it, because we all see it, and then keep going the direction we were going in, further out, until we're eventually pulled down to the furthest nadir and then have to come back up. And what's really interesting, and I'll end on this, is I guess this is like cool trivia, but I'm in good company here. I like etymology. You have monas or right, the monad, or n, the one. They're different, but really monas in this case is the one, the monad, the whole unity. And the second thing, you get the dias or dyad, which is separateness and an eternal tension, or not eternal, but unresolved tension, right? The indefinite tension. The root of that word, dia, is the root of the Latin word diabolos, for devil.
Nice. I also want to bring it back to even Nick's very first question is like, how do we see this coming up in our magical traditions for today and everything like that? And I think it's really important to know that Plato and all these characters that we're talking about were initiates of the Eleusinian mystery schools, as well as other mystery schools of that time, right? Plato was a Pythagorean at that same time as well. And these mystery schools are bringing upon the allegories and myths of, right, Persephone going into, again, the underworld, as we keep hitting on, and being stuck there because she ate of the pomegranate fruit. And then, we're trying to express and understand these lesser and greater mysteries of how the cyclical nature, the cyclical cycles of nature are moving, just like this. It's that internal understanding of the allegory of the tripartite soul and how these cyclical natures of our own soul are transmigrating from one time to the next, and then they move on through the mystery schools of the ages, that golden thread that spreads itself to the many myriads of individuals, even on this panel, as we practice our own magical traditions.
Yeah, and
right?
I've heard PD, you've referred to this particular brand, right? Because here's the thing: you can generically refer to magic as initiation, but I don't think that's accurate. I think magic, theurgy is specifically the application of the techniques and technologies of magic to the end of the purification, elevation, and illumination of the soul. Okay, whereas like not everybody uses it for that, but theurgy is particularly working in that dimension, which gives us the initiatory schools like the Golden Dawn, Aurum Solis, all claiming to do that. So I think it's important. It's interesting to talk about, but I think PD has a very unique perspective, specifically because of his work with you just work with so many different sort of, I guess what we could call them like shamanic cultures, where there's a descent and an ascent, or you've said to me before in private conversation, the descent is the ascent, but I've heard you also talk about what it is that you're interested in as models of ascent. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that in terms of Platonism, or how would you define models of ascent?
Really, I think what makes a model, a system real is the suspension of non-belief and the application of belief to it. If we look at, for instance, the picture of the subtle body in Taoism, there are multiple, right? Because there are multiple systems of Tao. You know this from your work with Chinese medicine, yeah? There are multiple subtle bodies, whether we're talking about martial arts, acupuncture. But if we compare that subtle body to the multiple subtle bodies in Hinduism and yoga, we're so familiar with the septenary chakra system, but there are so many chakra systems depending on who you're learning from. Some have 10, some have 8, some have 3, and so when we compare these pictures of the soul and the cosmos in which these traditions tell us these souls exist, who's right? Do we take the lowest common denominator and say this is right, or do we accept the fact that the soul is so mercurial that it takes on whatever we believe to be true?
Right.
And I don't want to get into the territory of chaos magic. I respect people who practice chaos magic, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying we can take anything and make it a divine praxis. There's something special in that, and saying that there is a sanctity in that, but that's not, to be clear, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, with each of these traditions, we meet them on their own terms, and this is how phenomenology works, how we move between emic and etic perspectives of a thing. We have to take it at its own word and say, okay, let's let's fly this plane right now and see where you can get. So when I say I'm fascinated by models of ascent, what I'm really saying is not how are they similar, but how are they different, and why is it that they all work once we suspend disbelief and apply magical fuel of belief to the practice? Then all of the sudden, again, the soul becomes the mercurial thing Jung said it was. It can be anything, and it's really our imagination. And I don't mean like fantasia, and I mean the okema, the soul vehicle, which is in Neoplatonism the seat of our imagination. When you look at somebody like Jung or Henry Corbin, and they're talking about active imagination, they're getting that term from the Neoplatonists, because there's a passive imagination, which is the daydreaming faculty, but then there's an active imagination, which comes about through purification of the soul. And this speaks to what Ike was saying a moment ago about how we define things. When we see the word initiation in a text that's been translated from the Greek, what they're usually translating is telete. Telete initiation means the beginning of a thing. Telete is its telos, the completion, the perfection of it. So what we're really talking about, initiation, is more akin to catharsis, to the initial purification of the soul that's necessary for it to, to borrow from a Buddhist term, to become that clean mirror of the Dharma that will literally reflect whatever world we can conceive. Because in the final analysis, we're not creatures like we think we are. When we say we can unite with a God, we're not saying we can hug them. We're saying that we can remember that we are them, choosing to participate in this kind of an experience. And for whatever reason, we can speculate. I think it probably has a lot to do with the existential boredom that arises from being the one thing. We don't know who or what we are until someone shows us to ourselves. So imagine being the one. There's no environment. You're not in a room. There's not a second. And you could say, well, God's all knowing. It says in the Bible, he's omniscient. But this great theologian, Orthodox theologian, John Scotus Eriugena, he says, what the fuck are you talking about? God doesn't know anything. Knowledge implies duality. There has to be a knower, a known, and the knowledge between them. He's like, I'm not saying God's stupid, but whatever knowledge is, it's the province of man. So how do you, as the one, acquire self-knowledge except to sacrifice yourself, dismember yourself, and
Right.
you show me? I can get a degree of self-knowledge through interacting with each of you, because each of you are the one. It's not this I think that's what Iamblichus is really getting at, that and Shaw really spells that in his book on Hellenistic Tantra, where he compares it to Abhinavagupta's Tantras, that this is it. And so when Ike says, that the ascent is the descent, the ascent is the descent, we're not ascending or descending. These are geocentric pictures of how the world works. Like Sun Ra says, when you get out in space, there's no up or down. You've got to be on a planet to have an up or down. It's useful while we're here doing this thing we're doing, but the ascent is the ascent is the descent. when we go up, it's really because the gods come down, but no motion has taken place. It's this right here is this holy meeting ground between one thing, not two things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, beautifully put. Beautifully put.
Yeah.
I would say maybe we could, like, my thoughts are, where do you see traces of this? Like, that's what I want to know. Where do you see traces of this kind of stuff in Plato? Because we're familiar with the Neoplatonic elaboration of this stuff. They sort of, if Plato gave us a house, they turned it into a mansion by adding rooms and kitchens and things like this. So one thing that I'm always interested in understanding is, Proclus calls, I think it's in his commentary on Euclid, I think, but I'm pretty sure he calls Plato a mystagogue. It's very different than a philosopher. He calls him a mystagogue, like a hierophant, somebody who reveals the mysteries. Do you think it was just this kind of, feedback looped evolution in some way of Plato, or do you think that they were putting things in there that were, stretched a little ways away from what we see when we look at the Platonic dialogues? Because basically what I'm trying to ask is, do you see evidence for the Neoplatonic worldviews of somebody like Iamblichus, Proclus, Plotinus in the actual Platonic dialogues? Or did they just do you think that they just put bells and whistles on a Christmas tree, so to speak, adorning it with these things that weren't necessarily organically there? I'm just curious because we've never talked about that.
That's a good question, a valid question. I think what we're seeing with the Neoplatonic readings of Plato and their commentaries is a group of very profound thinkers pushing a text to its limits. I don't think they're inserting things that aren't there. I think they're finding readings that we can't confirm or dispute because it's valid, right? Their reading is valid. Whether it's there or not, we can't say. And I'll tell you why, because we don't know what Plato thought. Plato put all of these different perspectives in the mouths of other people, and that's the beauty of the dialogue, is that it allows dialectic to emerge through the interaction of these oppositional perspectives. But as far as what Plato himself thought, we don't have a fucking clue what Plato thought. All we can do is read the dialogues. And that's why I say it's not up to us to determine whether the Neoplatonists' readings are valid, because we're doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. We're walking away with our best perception of what they're saying, and we ourselves push these texts to their limit, even if we try to limit them and say that stuff's not in there, because we can't know that. We can't know what Plato is saying himself.
And to your point, you consistently see over and over Plato saying, he's like, well, I don't know anything. I'm just asking questions.
In true Socratic form.
In true Socratic method. And he's breaking things down to the essence of what the forms are, to the point that a lot of times when they get done with the conversation, the person will be like, well, I don't know what I believe anymore, or what I thought I believed.
I do that all the time and did not know that's like the little method that was used. Wow.
But that is the logical, as far as the logical structure of logic, rhetoric, and fallacy, that I think kind of comes forth into, again, the Christ phenomenon, calling himself the truth and the way and the light. So he is in a synchronistic matter, kind of bringing this idea of truth into the modern day, and he's claiming lineage from before the time of the temple priests back to Melchizedek, in order to subvert and go back to the original forms of ascended thinking.
I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Gomurkin. He recently passed away, fairly recently. I mean, I think it's been a year, 2 years.
A year, I think.
But he was involved in this Copenhagen conference with a number of other presenters, that really pissed a lot of people off, especially Orthodox Jews, because they're using textual evidence to try and determine whether or not the Jewish writings have been antedated. And if they have, what's their actual date?
Yep.
And if we can determine their actual date, does that tell us anything about where some of these ideas came from?
And that's when you get into the early, as far as the first 5 books of the Torah, and the church coming out and saying these are the books of Moses. Voltaire, he argues and shows all, and he says, they're not brought up in the Psalms, they're not brought up in any of the past, texts, and so they just kind of, it's like, as far as the dating of these things and when these things came,
there's the Numenius, he makes this statement. He says, what is Plato but Moses speaking Attic Greek, right? And he's Numenius is subtle, like he's making a point there, and that point speaks to what Gomurkin conclusions are, that rabbis in exile encountered the writings of Plato, probably at the Library of Alexandria, and those writings particularly were the Timaeus and the Laws. And whether or not the Torah existed in some form prior to that, he demonstrates, it argues very, very well that if it did exist, it was rewritten after the encounter with Plato's work, after their encounter with Hellenism, which explains why we get something like a Merkaba, this soul chariot that has no precedent other than the Okima, which means chariot, and it's this soul vehicle, right? So lots of problems there, if you know what I mean.
May I ask?
That plays into the whole origin of the Septuagint translation, which took place right there in Alexandria at that time, and it really points to, okay, so like, why is it called Genesis? Why is it called Exodus? Why is it called Deuteronomia? Deuteronomy. These are Greek words. The titles of the books are Greek.
And the Septuagint number itself, I think, beckons to the harmony of the spheres and the sevenfold celebration of the Alexandria, really the average person would have known about and realized that title might have beckoned to. I wonder, and even the allegory of the cave too, I feel like is similar to, if not influential on the Genesis Garden of Eden, right? And I wonder too, what does it say, the relationship of the influence, but also that it would seem that there's different expressions and sayings in the Bible from Paul that beckon directly to Plato. And I wonder if you guys have looked into that or seen that and what that might say.
Ike, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Paul is very much associated with not necessarily Greek philosophy, but certainly with a place like Athens, right? Because he goes there to the Areopagus rock and he makes that, which if you're standing on the Areopagus, you can see the Acropolis. It's directly across, and it would have been just above the Plaka and the Agora where everybody met. So this is in central Athens, converting people. And if you go there today, there's a plaque with that famous speech about telling people, like, you don't know what you worship, but in Christianity it's different. We understand these, and so on and so forth. To me, I think that he was part of a deeper tradition, a more profound tradition, having to do with the Platonic worldview. And here's the thing. If you were educated, your science in that time, your science was basically Platonic. This whole idea of the cosmos and the nested spheres and stuff like that. The first time, right? We understand the harmony of the spheres. Really, that is later. It's in Neo-Pythagoreanism, and the fragments of the early Pythagoreans, like Philolaus, and they're more interested in politics and community living and what you shouldn't eat and what you should eat and that kind of stuff. Really, all the number and harmony stuff comes around this time that we're talking about, a Hellenistic period, maybe 300 years before the first century, so on and so forth. But all of that stuff, you get this cosmology of nested spheres and things like this, these 8 spheres. The first time that we see that, it's posited almost contemporaneous, these two things. You have Eudoxus, who gives us that model. He puts that forth into the learned society of that time. And right around that same time, like within a year or two, most scholars agree, is when Plato writes or finishes the Republic. And at the end of book 10 of the Republic, there's this little section called the Myth of that gives us that whole kind of nested sphere cosmology. And you'll see in the writings of Paul, which kind of tie into what PD was saying about the Merkava tradition. He talks about how, most biblical scholars and people engaging in hermeneutics, they'll say that he was talking about himself. I don't know, but sure. He's talking about, I once knew a brother who was assumed, who was taken up into the third heaven. So he's using Platonic verbiage to discuss this, but I don't necessarily know that he's like specifically part of a Platonic, I don't know, a neo, a Hellenistic sort of like mystery cult, so much as it's like, if you just look around at the knowledge of the world at that time, the ancient Mediterranean, it's all based on Plato already, so it's like, that's like me coming and talking about gravity. And then like, in 1,000 years, people are like, well, maybe this guy was in like, the cult of Newton. It's like, no, it's just everybody fucking knew it. Everybody knows that guy. Everybody knows it. It's taught widely. So, and that's how we orient. Like, think of that. That's weird, right? The entire globe almost orients there, or at least in the educated aspects, they know the concept of gravity and stuff like that. So I think it's a similar concept there, where Paul it's just the vernacular that he's using. Is so embedded in any kind of learned society. And we know he had to have been somewhat learned because he wrote, people, again, PD pointed out earlier, like the ancient worldview and that experience, we've been completely abstracted from that. So we don't think about like, oh, not everybody could read and write. As a matter of fact, most people couldn't read or write, so if he's dealing in these circles, he likely has some grounding in the quote unquote science of his time, which was very much so Platonic.
Yeah.
Just my thoughts.
The entire tradition of a sacred book, incredibly new idea. In the ancient world, religion was something that was practiced. It was physical. You were completely immersed in it. There wasn't a sacred text. Those kinds of things entered with these mystery traditions, when you would get the symbolon, the password to get into whatever tradition it is you're exploring. And in regard to Paul, I think there's great, what Ike said is spot on about him ascending into the third heaven. Again, this is another confirmation of a Greek cosmoconception. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. But as far as what he might have been involved with, I can't remember the author's name. There's a book on Paul and the mysteries of baptism. I've got it in the other room, but I don't want to leave you guys and go dig it up. But I can, if anybody's interested, reach out to me later. I'll give you the title of the book. But it's looking at Paul's very likely involvement with non-Christian mystery traditions prior to his conversion. and he is a soldier type figure, which really makes the cult of Mithras very possible. And they have that same model of ascent, of traveling up through the heavens, right, to get to the final grade of pater, of father, to meet with the Father, become one with the Father, and then embody the Father as a hierophant on earth. So it's been argued that he was involved with them, but as to whether he was and whether he's even talking about himself, like Ike said, we don't know that, but we can be 100% certain that he's drawing on Greek tradition when he says that.
I do recall reading about Paul as far as Saul of Tarsus. In Tarsus, there was a figure called Zes that was a dead and ascended god that actually rose to become Asdes, which is light. So there was a tradition in that region of this ascended form that kind of, and you see this development of transcendentalism from going to, Sheol, this place, or with the Zoroastrians, the idea of burning off the bad parts so that you could return to the monad. It kind of, you just see this evolving, and like you said, as far as traveling out, and then you have the various night journeys that begin of all the different prophets and how they're taken into the heavens and shown the workings of the cosmos. So you're seeing this evolution of these transcendental forms of people realizing that there are, higher realms of understanding, in time and space. Yeah.
You get a perfect example of that in the Greek magical papyri. If you look at the Mithras liturgy, in the ritual, they call it a ritual of apothanatismos, which means of not dying, of becoming immortal. But it's interesting because this apothanatismos isn't permanent. When you come down from the ascent, you are thanatismos again. You can die. You're no longer immortal. Right. So immortality is this glimpse into eternity, and when, like, the language is so problematic, because if you say to someone, well, I experienced eternity, logically, no, the fuck you didn't. You weren't at the beginning. There is no end. You're right here. How can you say that you participated in eternity? But that's how we know that it's not about a duration of time. It's that Mithraic aeon that transcends time, something more like the pleroma, right? It's outside of time, which Jung would say that means it's a qualia, a quality of consciousness, not a quanta that we can count and say there's the beginning, there's the end. So in that ascent ritual, really, I think the best example of one from that era, it's wrapped up with this same expansion of vision, expansion of consciousness, but we always have to come back down. And I think that's important, because we're useless as a hermit on top of a mountain praying for the world somewhere. Like Zarathustra in Nietzsche, you have to come back down the mountain. Enlightenment isn't climbing the top of the mountain and staying there. Enlightenment is summiting the mountain, coming back down, and then allowing what you saw from that perspective to inform your behavior when you're late for work, right? Or when you're trying to check out at the grocery store, or you're beginning to have road rage, that's the real enlightenment experience. If we don't come back down, we don't complete the cycle. And that's what Ike was mentioning a moment ago, these cycles that Proclus talks so much about. We have the pruodos, the descent into a body, the coming down from the mountain. But then we have that epistrophe, the return, that anagogic ascent. And it's this cyclic process that maintains a connection between to use a spatial category, which is really fallacious, but we have to think about it somehow. maintains that connection between the gods and man at the bottom of the chain. We have to go up and come back down over and over and over, even to the point of death and rebirth, right? But really, there's no motion. There's no movement. It's happening every second. Genesis is happening constantly, is what the Kabbalists say, and I believe that. And there's an article that came out a few years ago in Esquire about this guy who went to a 10-day Buddhist retreat, and they're practicing Vipassana, and he goes psychotic, ends up being carried away in handcuffs and taken to a mental institution, because he enters that space where the world is simultaneously dying and being reborn every second. Every second. Right. So the idea of going up and going down, it's just a convenient way to articulate something that is really ineffable, but is so close and so present that it's like the fish asking what is water. It's you can't put your finger on it.
Yeah, and we have this is an issue I find with people that come to magic and learn things like the Kabbalah and or at least the Hermetic Kabbalah, right, the magical Kabbalah, but especially also in taking students through the Platonic dialogues. This is something that I kind of have to combat, where it's like, this stuff should be a scaffolding to the project of what should be an internal experience, a gnosis. Somebody asked me, I spoke at the Sacred Space Between the Worlds conference yesterday in Maryland, and I gave a whole thing on theurgy, right, but magic and myth in it. And I got a question that was a valid question. It's like, would you consider theurgy mystical? I said no, because it's ceremonial, but theurgy should make you a mystic, because the experiences that we are having are here in the eye of the soul, type of thing. And again, in the active imagination that's being seized by the divine and divinized. This is a big thing when we say catharsis, right? Purification. A lot of people think it's this moral thing. It's like, well, my soul feels pure. I don't feel like I need to, it's purification is the removal of obstructions to right view. A lot of people think insight is the accumulation of information. In reality, to PD's point, the top of that mountain is you divesting yourself of things that you accumulated from that perspective. And so insight is clarity. It's not, it's not about how much of this stuff you can pack into your brain if you're going to put the cart before the horse. So it's all this stuff has to remain a scaffolding for us to approach and talk about. And this is very big in the Platonic dialogue, particularly in the Timaeus, when the chief interlocutor of that dialogue, Timaeus, is about to start talking about time and eternity. That's how he starts his discussion of cosmogony. He distinguishes, okay, there's an eternal component that the demiurge for some reason looks at and sees perfection in eternity and decides to make a copy of it. And that copy he calls the moving image of eternity. And it's based on space and therefore time. And if you notice, there's a threefold nature to it, right? And this might be a little esoteric for people, but I'm assuming if you're into me and what PD do, you're kind of familiar with this stuff. He takes the circuit of the same and the circuit of the different, comprised of this kind of even and odd quality. They're two-dimensional. They're circles, two-dimensional. Now, how do you create three dimensions from two-dimensional figures? You insert them into each other. And now you've created a sphere. You've created three dimensions, beginning, middle, and end. That is, he's creating the paradigm of time, right? Because then he says, this isn't the cosmos. This is the blueprint of the cosmos.
Right.
Time, cyclical nature. But what Timaeus, in talking about all this, he says, listen, there's really no way that we're going to be able to actually put this shit into words. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do my best to talk about it mythopoetically, I like to say, rather than mythologically, because there's a stigma to that. Mythopoetically, we only have recourse to mythology to really show this to us. And as Socrates says, I think at the end of the Myth of in book 10, he does a brief digression where he says, if the myth had convinced us, it would save us.
Well, with Timaeus and that cosmology, you also see a very similar aspect in Zoroaster in regard to the beginning, the middle, and the end, and bringing about the end times philosophy through Judaism into modern Christianity and Islam.
Mm-hmm. And the necessity of these myths, like Ike said, it's what allows us to discuss this. Our minds need a picture. It needs something to hang on to. Without that, what we're left with is what's called apophaticism, apophatic mysticism, which is a mysticism of negation. Anything we say about the divine is wrong because it's limiting it to that thing. Anything we could possibly say. So we deconstruct our picture of the transcendent step by step until we face what Dionysius, the Areopagite, called the bright darkness, but he doesn't leave us with that. He goes on to say, but we need cataphatic mysticism, and cataphatic meaning to bring it down, to bring that high, lofty, transcendent something down into something we can discuss and talk about, like a crucifix or a tree of life, something that can give us a picture, because the human mind needs a picture to hang on to, even if that picture is completely superfluous, fallacious. It'll never do justice to what we're talking about. But without that picture, without that myth, there's nothing to talk about. And then you fall into that Zen trap, and a Zen master, they're fine in that trap, but trying to take a novice into that territory without something like a cone or something they can hold on to, it's an insurmountable gap. So the myths, I agree with Ike. They're essential, but really cannot get us there. But if anything's going to, they will.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. If anything's going to get us there, that will. Myths will, or because it's really I kind of characterize it as a symbolic vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
That's almost like algebraic. It's trying to bring, right, like the Pythagorean theorem. You're taking two knowns to find an unknown. And that's we know these images, we understand these relationships between a hawk and the sun, Horus and Ra, and so on and so forth. And we're using two known things to find an unknown. And the one thing I would recommend people who are interested in studying Plato, first start with the first Alcibiades. And I would say move through the 12 dialogues of the Iamblichian curriculum.
I'm editing those right now, so maybe in 6 months I'll have it published.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And I would say when you do dive into these dialogues, keep this mythopoetic structure in mind. There's a lot that you will extract from for instance, in the Cratylus, right? The sort of prologue to the epistemological tetrad. For anybody who's caught up on that term, it's just, epistemology is what can and cannot be known, why or why not. And there's a series of dialogues where it becomes very mercurial. Now in the Cratylus, he's talking about the suitability of names and things. The person that Socrates is talking to, his name is Hermogenes, right? Born of Hermes, right? So there's tons of stuff like that all over the dialogues. They're completely saturated with little things like that, little tells, little layers, little tiny things. I mean, you look at there's the divided line, there's the allegory of the cave, there's the myth of there's the myth of the afterlife in Phaedo. There's that cosmogon or cosmological ascent caravan of the Phaedrus up in the celestial vault. He's constantly using myths. He's constantly creating myths. So it's, if you look at those dialogues like that, I think that you're going to extract much more. And like, what was ancient Greece famous for? Mythology. You know, Orpheus, even Pythagoras, or Pythagoras' quote unquote teacher, especially Pherecydes, they were mythographers. If you look at the Derveni papyrus, which is the oldest actual primary source in Europe in terms of that literature, it's the oldest document. It appears to be this pedagogical commentary on philosophically and ontologically interpreting mythology through the lens of Orpheus. So this was, it's kind of like what PD was saying before. They would have known this stuff, especially people in the academy. And the final point I want to put on that, and I'm interested to see what PD has to say about this. I've had a couple of confirmations from others that I really, really respect. But when I started I take students through this curriculum. We do the Iamblichian curriculum plus Porphyry's Isagoge, the Organon of Aristotle, and of course the Republic. You can't not do the Republic. And then from there we move into introductions to arithmetic, start getting into the quadrivium sort of thing, like Nicomachus, Theon of Smyrna, all these guys. But then you get into the geometric stuff, okay, the geometry. And what was over, the fabled inscription over the gate to Platonic Academy, let no one enter here who is ignorant of geometry. And I always wondered why that was the case. And I said, okay, the divided line is geometric. There's a whole way to geometrically kind of recreate that line and show the golden ratio. You've got things like the moving image of eternity in the Timaeus, very geometric, the geometric proof in the Meno. But here's the interesting thing. When you begin to actually practice geometry, starting out, I use Lawler, not Euclid, because Euclid is tough for people that don't understand this stuff. And it's all about proofs. It's all about logic. There's no spiritual commentary. There's no metaphysical commentary. So in using the first couple of books of Lawler, who translated Theon of Smyrna, so it's nice. It fits in nicely where there's a gap in the literature, because there's a tremendous gap in the ancient Neo-Pythagorean geometric stuff. What you realize is that in just silence of practicing that geometry and understanding it, you realize I am learning literally the coding for the universe. Now, what the Platonists and Neoplatonists say is you are assimilating yourself to the way that the divine thinks. And I personally believe that the reason why you couldn't be ignorant of geometry to enter into Plato's Academy, even if it's just a fable, is because was in the practice of geometry that taught these people how to think philosophically. Not the other way around. The practice of geometry does to your fucking mind is teaches you how to think philosophically. It's like going to the gym for noetic ascent. It's just practicing geometry. It's unbelievable. But I'm interested to hear if that sounds just like batshit crazy off the rails to you.
No, I don't at all. I think another aspect of why it's so important has to do with beauty, right? We get these when the forms are discussed directly. The ones that are confirmed, we hear about the form of the good, the form of the beautiful, and the form of the true, right? And the truth and the beauty are hallmarks of the good. If we see that, we know it's close to and participating in the form of the good. And I think the beauty and the truth of it have a lot to do with why it's so effective in that regard. We know it's true because true, we're talking about when that word is used in Freemasonry, we're talking about something that's square, right? that's that works mathematically, it's going to fit together perfectly. So when we're talking about is something true, we're really saying does it fit together in a harmonious manner? But the beauty aspect, geometry is arguably the most beautiful thing about existing on this planet in this domain. But there is wordplay that Socrates uses, that Proclus unpacks, where he uses the word against Claytor, because the word for beauty in Claytor, which means to call out, are almost identical. And you know how Plato is with his wordplay. It's almost, if you don't know the Greek, you miss it. But it's all through the dialogues. But what he's getting at is, like, where does a rose end? Is it just at the rose itself, or is it as far as I can smell that rose? And that smell is what Socrates is likening to a call. It's calling us. And that call is the mean that exists between the observer and the observed. And remember what Proclus says about the soul. The soul is a mean. It's a mean. It's a ratio between the physical and the non-physical, between psyche and physis. Like between nous and physis is what psyche is. So when we see something and are attracted to its beauty, that's a physical, a visual call. And it tells us something about the ratio between us. Where do I end and where does that begin? Is there a line where we can say it begins or ends? And to take the next step and say, well, that call, that beauty, that mean, that ratio, that's our soul, I think really speaks to the efficacy of geometry, even working at a what we might call an unconscious level. It forces the harmonies of the universe, including ourselves and our interaction with the world, to be put right in our face.
And to that point, when you look in what is it, Fideo, where he talks about harmony in essence, when you create an instrument and you play that instrument and you bring these beautiful sounds out of it, that those aren't, like you're talking about, the line between where a thing ends and where a thing begins. If you take that instrument and destroy it, you're in no way, destroying the harmony, because you can build another instrument to recreate this. It's always existing. It's always there. It's just a matter of how we're able to draw it out. Personally.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
Which requires skill and requires knowledge, right, to tune an instrument, particularly. Yep. And the one thing that I want to add on to there is that in the ancient conception of harmonics, there were effectively three ratios: sesquialter, sesquitertian, and sesquioctave. Okay, so that's the root and octave, which are basically the same thing. There's the fourth and the fifth. So there's three perfect ratios right there. Now in the Platonic the dialogue, the Phaedo that you were just mentioning, talks about the tripartite soul. This actually is an extension from the Pythagorean, so where they thought there were three types of people.
Right.
Okay, the curious was the rational, the ambitious was the spirited, and the covetous was the appetitive. And Plato puts those into the tripartite nature of the soul. Now, think of it this way: these three ratios that have to have relationship to each other, the appetites, the emotions, and then the rational. They have to be the same way. Think of it this way: if you understand the piano and music theory, a proper chord consists of three tones. Okay, now if one tone is playing a blue note, it's off by a half step. we don't have harmony anymore. We have dissonance.
Discord,
Classically, you know, the modern mind delights in ugly things. It's just what we've done. We've created a new paradigm of inversion, and it's one of the reasons why everything is fucked. Everybody looking out at this, and that's like, you like ugly shit. You love the disharmonious. What the fuck do you think you're gonna get? You're gonna get the harmony out of disharmony, you know. So it's, the thing is, now if you orient that chordal structure and its right relationships to each other, and then you think about that as the tripartite nature of the soul, everybody knows the discomfort automatically when you play a blue note, when you play something that's an accidental, something that's inharmonious. It's ooh. Now, can you imagine the existential discomfort?
Right.
The existential discomfort of having one of those three parts of the soul not where it's supposed to be. You know, so, and now his medicine, his philosophical medicine for us is the application of the four virtues. You see it in the Alcibiades, you see it in the Gorgias, you see it's fucking everywhere. A lot of people love to talk about it in the context of the Republic. He literally takes you through all four of those cardinal virtues in almost every single dialogue in the
same thing with laws. Yeah,
exactly. Why? Because like, this is the medicine. These four things make it so that you will always be harmonious. If you conform yourself to these things, you will always be creating harmony.
And to that point, in regard to the creation of the state, Plato even at one point talks about doing gymnastics in the womb in order to train. And basically you have to learn these things from the earliest ages and be edified in these things as you come up. And the building of that whole individual person is what creates the solidity of what is the macro to the micro, the larger state, you know, in essence. So it's a matter of this system of, again, like the transcendent aspect of moving up towards the monad. You know, it's the same idea with the state and the individual within the state, and it's always in larger ideas than you know, like it's the multi entendres. You know,
I like the cut of your jibs, sailor.
I like what you said, Ike, about tritones and about, you know, flattening the third and entering these you know, sustained two chords that they do not qualify as beauty. You'll hear people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Plato would say, get the fuck out of here with that bullshit.
100%.
The weirdness of an off chord is interesting.
Right.
It's curious. It's fascinating. It's not beautiful. And this is coming from somebody that listens to Ornette Coleman and John Zorn. You know, I love some chaotic, dissonant music, but I would never call it beautiful. Beauty is a specific form, and learning to recognize that is really the first step to getting anywhere in Platonism.
Right. I think there's one point, and this is just recently in what I've been looking into in regard to laws. I think it's 4 or 5 where they're talking about comedy, and then he goes into the tragedians, and he says if a group of a troop of tragedians showed up at the city and wanted to set up in the town square, it's like, first off, no, that's not going to happen. You need to check what their material is. You need to check like what the philosophy is and whether it's in accordance, in resonance with the structure of the state itself. And if it's not, then you run them off.
Yeah.
So it's, and you see this symbolically from lower levels to higher levels, talking about children, talking about comedy, it's in every aspect. What one does in their younger life, they'll do less in their older life. It's this dichotomy between the play, between the existence and the non-existence in simultaneity.
I have a question for anyone who wants to answer. And this is, you know, a legitimate, honest question. How do you distinguish beyond the understanding that Republic is very much talking about the proper constitution of the soul of an individual,
Right,
of the mind, of the body, because that is acceptable to most people. But how do you defend, if you would even want to, the objection that what's being described as a totalitarian or fascist state?
Yeah, it is 100% a fascist, totalitarian, monarchical dictator state.
Well, here's the thing, though. Here's where it differs, and this is the
Yeah.
key to what you said before about the tragedians in the laws. He talks about that in the Republic. He basically says, "Look, we're not going to have poets. That's not what's going to happen." And he says it's much lamentable. Very lamentable. But the thing is, they can say things that are pleasant and convincing,
Right.
and not have the truth in them. In the same way, there's no beauty in a sus chord. There's novelty and interest, piquing your interest. In the same way, in poetry, it could sound, it could fill you with this sense of righteousness or what have you. But it doesn't mean anything they're saying has any truth in it, even though it sounds good. Okay, that's something we all got to keep in mind today.
Right.
Okay, now, what's interesting is he says, he basically makes a caveat, unless we can definitively know that they have become philosophers. And it's the same thing with the philosopher regent.
Yes.
Is that the only person who's fit to rule is the person who understands this shit and applies it to themselves. So here's the thing. If the ruler applies this system to themselves, it's not tyrannical.
Right.
And therefore, it's not tyrannical to apply it to a civilization. Why? Because the definition Plato gives us of tyranny.
Yes.
He says, first of all, he says, democracy inevitably leads to tyranny because it allows us too many liberties. Every time he says the democratic man is the father of the tyrant. Why? Because the tyrant is not just somebody who has control. The tyrant is somebody who abuses that control because they are a slave. What are they a slave to? Their own appetites. The tyrant is actually the fucking slave in the Platonic system.
Yeah.
This is a system of liberation through philosophy. Okay, so I don't consider that fascistic.
And that's the whole thing. You can call it these things, but at the same time, because it's based on this idea of ascendance and the higher thought forms, it's an alternate way to look at the monarchy or a system that becomes fascist in essence. But in accordance with the higher realms, that's one thing. This is very utopian in essence as far as philosophy. But when you sink into the more crystallized, realm of dog eat dog and greed and everyone out for their own, it turns into this corrupted, everything's corrupted. So it's this idea of, in this realm, it's like, communism works on a small level, but once it gets so big, it creates a caste system. Whereas with this, because, we're in the physical realm, this utopian idea, this mindset of higher forms, unfortunately, because of the corrupted state of man, has a tendency to eat itself.
I also have an idea to answer your question, PD.
Okay.
And that idea is that I think we forget, and not maybe anyone here, but that this is a dialogue and that this is a drama. And the idea of this being a drama would mean that there are outrageous things that are going to be stated, like the ideals of eugenics, the ideals of, different ideas of like only the philosopher kings now know whose children are parented to who, and all these strange things that we today in a modern society would deem to be a totalitarian or B, fascist or C, murderous. And really, it is what it's meant to do. And I think this is a really important distinction, is that it's meant to show the contradictory nature of not only the human soul and not only the polis, but that when we are taken outside of our normal everydayness, we can start to understand the true nature of what Plato through Socrates was trying to do. And he's trying to teach us how to philosophize. And it is,
and again, we don't know what Plato thought. That's what you're getting at as well, is that as a dialogue.
That's
multiple
exactly it.
And
that is exactly
he says that too. And again, we don't scholars are it's a coin toss whether or not it's authentic. But in his second letter, Plato says the thoughts of the beliefs of Plato will never be written down. The dialogues are Socrates made beautiful.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring up one more thing in regard to the Abrahamic religion. I find it interesting. I've been going through the Talmud lately, and I'm about a tenth of the way through it. And I find it's very much set up in the same methodology of the Platonic philosophies in regard to the rabbis coming together and basically having a dialogue about a subject matter that oftentimes is never resolved. So I think there you may also have kind of a character, because that wasn't written until 400 to 600 AD. So I think there you may also have some carryover with kind of these ideas and how the philosophies kind of played into the growing strands of the different religions as well.
Yeah,
right.
I want to just point out one thing actually that was pointed out to me by David Chaim Smith. He had studied with he's one of my Kabbalah teachers, but he had studied with some Hasidics, right? And there's a very richly preserved tradition of Hebrew Kabbalah in there. And also there's a rich preservation within their Kabbalistic vernacular of Greek words. Like, for instance, the name for them of like matter, or the first principle of formation, is hiuli. That's, the ile or the hule of the Greeks. There's all sorts of shit like that all over their Kabbalism. But what he said is when he went in and to engage in this pedagogical kind of discourse, at a long table, like banquet style, and at either end there was a rabbi on one side and an acolyte on the other. And they were only working with each other, similar to the way you'd see people playing chess. And they would have the text open in front of them. And the idea was not that the text has the answers, but that the text is a prompting for further insight. And so this is, having understood that, I see the influence of the dialectic of the Platonic school, or the Socratic school, and now I apply that to the dialogues with students. It's like, this is not our Bible, it's not gospel, but what it is we're going to use this to do what they're doing. About what they're doing.
In the same manner,
do dialectic
of elevating the spirit and finding the wholeness of the self and the soul. And yes.
Well, I think, and just to reiterate the idea that Socrates is bringing upon the precarious and the subversive position of the philosopher, and how the philosopher is the true rebel in the Republic and in Athens at that time, due to obviously Socrates trying to prove the point. And I would think, and I think Leo Strauss and a few other philosophers in that time frame, Alan Bloom being one of them, in our time frame, is saying how important it is to know that the apology, the actual true apology, was the Republic. And I think that's really fascinating to think about.
Well, I just want to say, man, Danny, PD, every time I learn so much every time I talk to you, dude.
Same.
I really do. I love you. I miss you. I got to come out and see you again.
Definitely. We need you out here.
Yeah.
I need to come to you next. We're supposed to do some crystal digging.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. At the gem mines over here.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Nice.
So your place next.
Yes.
I really wanted to ask a question. You were talking about purification, right? It made me think of Plotinus, and he reiterates over and over this stripping of what's alien to yourself. And I think that's, like Marx was saying, I think like you were all saying, like that is the process of dialectic to an extent, at least dialectic of yourself. But it made me think of this other concept of Plato's that is very unique to Plato, which is the idea of the intelligibles and of them as like these divine beings, right? And the further that you kind of ascend and strip yourself of those alien things, you know, you kind of ascent. And if you compare those intelligibles to humans, right, a big difference is that those intelligibles, I mean, obviously, not only do they not have the sensory faculties, but they are not necessarily human, you know, they're almost mechanical. They have, they don't have like perhaps changing will. But a big question that I always have is, you know, when we're looking at these hierarchies, when we're looking at these intelligences, how, I know this is kind of off base perhaps, but how do you differentiate the planetary forces or intelligences and the angelic ones?
That's a good question. I'll take a quick stab, and I think I know Ike has a good answer for this because we've talked about something similar at New Hermopolis. When we're talking about the hierarchy of being, let's refer back to the principles, the limit and the limitless. At the top is pure limit. At the bottom is pure limitlessness, the indefinite dyad. As we progress from the top to the bottom towards the middle, these become mixed. So there's when you say they're mechanical, I don't take you to mean robotic, but rather they have more limit than they do limitlessness. They can't swerve, for instance, from the orbit for which they exist. If I understood you properly there.
Yes, exactly. Like they are more restricted. They have like a certain role, or they're maybe closer to the forms, and so they have more distinct and consolidated properties or identifiers about themselves, their way of behaving, maybe even metaphysical properties of, you know, the further up that you go. Like I would say that the planetary intelligences are also metaphysical properties of the universe.
That's a great way to put it. And if you look at Proclus's breakdown of the hierarchy of being, and you see it earlier in Iamblichus, but there's when he talks about the cosmic gods, and he also refers to them as the visible gods. And we're like, what do you mean visible gods? Where are you seeing them? He's talking about the planets. You know, these are cosmic gods that we can see visibly, but in cosmic meaning they're in matter, so they have more connection with the limitless than they do with limit. Whereas the further we go up the chain, beyond the sun is Helios, right? Which has even more limit, less limitlessness. So we're really talking about the tension, like Ike said earlier, between these two extreme opposites. And I think is it Heraclitus that talks about the tension of the bowstring that is necessary, that produces the music, that shoots the arrow. It's that same tension. But when you say, how do you distinguish an angelic being from a planetary being, the real criteria is how much or how much less of limit or limitlessness do they participate in.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I and of course I look at it in the same way where we're looking at like ontological chains. Again, this is an analogy, the verticality of it, like the tree of life. We're not saying that it's literally like a beam of consciousness being projected downward, but it's you're meeting the same consciousness at different, you know, I have to be a little new agey about it, at a different frequency level. You know, it's kind of like, here's a good example, like a Chladni plate, right? So the Chladni plate is what people associate with cymatics. I made one and did a demo for the Institute of Hermetic Studies a couple of years ago, and you connect a piece of metal, piece of sheet metal, to a speaker. There's a sophisticated way to do this because you don't want to deaden it. You just want the vibrations to go into it. And then I have like a frequency generator that's hooked up to this speaker, and I'm moving up and down these frequency lines. Okay. You pour a little bit of very, very, very fine sand or very, very fine salt on it. And once you hit a certain frequency, the sand will begin to generate a geometric shape. That's not the shape of the frequency. That's the shape of the piece of metal. It's geometry that's holding it together. It's geometric signature. Now, you move a little bit further and the sand doesn't do anything. You keep going, boom. Okay, look, now there's another frequency, and for some reason the sand's moving again. Maybe it's kind of like quadrupled, and what's the reason for that? The relationships that these frequencies have to each other. There's frequencies all throughout. You could move all the way down that line, you know, and just do this weird thing. But for a specific phenomenal object, there's a specific frequency that reveals its inherent patterns, its geometric patterns. To me, this is evidence of the synthemata. Okay, this is like what they were intuiting. You know, it's like there's the God in there, and it has different levels or expressions on that specific frequency line, like a musical scale, like a diatonic musical scale. So when you're tuning into these different beings, I think of it in that way. I'm working this frequency. I'm playing the scale of Mars. I'm working the scale of the sun. And PD makes a very, very good point, which is at the core of Platonism, Neoplatonism, and early Christianity. Free will. That's what that unlimit is. Free will. He said, well, you know, if there's more limit, they can't like turn to their right. Free will is really, really important. So a lot of times in working with them practically, which is kind of outside of the scope of this particular conversation, but in saying something of, you know, we work with the a derivative of the pseudo-Dionysian hierarchies in the Golden Dawn, because that's what Agrippa's mostly using, and that's where we get our things. The type of, and let's not forget these images of the deities, of the angels, that's not what they are. Okay, we have to create an image in order to interact. This is what PD was saying before. Our mind needs an image. Right? Otherwise, things start talking to you. What happens? You go to the mental hospital. Okay, like you need to set this up so that I'm intentionally. This is you. I want you to talk to me through this. It's an agreed upon image that is ultimately relying on your available imagery. The type of Iamblichus talks about this. He delineates what he calls theurgic appearance. He says, and it all has to do with how much light they give off and what quality it is. So gods will give off this pure white, overwhelming light, whereas like daimones they're a little darker, a little murkier, a little ruddier. And light is also synonymous with intelligence in these traditions. The great Professor Walter Hanegraaff has pointed out many times, there's an etymological connection between the word nous and light, particularly in the Hermetica. So there's that quality of consciousness, but I want to just sum it up by also kind of bringing it full circle to what we've spoken about in terms of Platonism. In the Platonic paedia, paedia, right, means education. What is that? It's because what did he think education was? Not the learning of new information, but the recollection of things your soul already knows. Anamnesis. Okay? The Greek word for truth is aletheia. That means not forgotten. It's all about remembering. And it ties into this free will. Okay? The ethical training in the beginning of the Platonic paedia allows you more free will. You have a greater ability to make choices based on what you know is best, which is allowing the rational part of the soul to govern the other two. Okay, that's the beginning. You gain more free will, right? As Jocko Willink very, very philosophically puts it, discipline is freedom. Discipline is freedom. And there's this word for discipline, self-control, and temperance that gets translated across the board, and depending on which translation you're using of Plato, sophrosini. It can mean balance, but it also gets translated as self-control or discipline, and it is appropriate in all those contexts. Now, that's a little bit lower down the ontological line. As you go through the theurgic theophania and the enosis, right, the revelation of deities, and then the eventual union, you gain more free will higher up the line. Okay, why? Because you're constantly identifying with what you actually are, and not having this not the rational soul not being impelled to the imperatives and the impulses of physical matter, because they're fundamentally different, the soul and the body, in terms of their natures. The soul is effervescent; it rises up, it is immortal, it is not spatially specific. The body's different. You know, the soul has no needs. Plato says the only time the soul needs anything is when it's in a body, and it has to get into the noetic realm to be nourished by the beauty there. Okay, but it inherently has no needs. The body is different. The body has needs. I got to pee. I got to eat. I got to sleep. You know, the body is spatially specific. The body is not immortal. It will die. So there's this constant, like, we're confounded. Which direction do we orient our intelligence? Which direction are we working in? And it all has to do with free will. So I think, believe it or not, as you get higher up the line, these things have less free will, in my experience. They have great power and less free will. Why? Because and Iamblichus says this, when deities appear in theurgic appearance, they're accompanied by their daimones. They're accompanied by their entourage. Why? Because it's those things that like execute its divine will.
They're zippers.
Which is kind of interesting. But I don't know. It's interesting to me also how, like, the soul is really the only thing that gains more free will as it rises, and that's just my personal anecdotal experience of these things. Is nothing like definitively tying anything I said to Platonism.
No, I think it does. You're absolutely right. We see there's a great quote in Us Divinis where he says philosophy in the ancient world entailed trials and ordeals and modes of initiation, you know, and he said, and most importantly, it consolidated all of one's ethics, politics, economy into one thing. He said, so to philosophize is essentially to orientate yourself properly to the world. And he describes this, he illustrates this by saying, it's like moving through a sacred calendar, like the liturgical cycle, and following the natural patterns that the demiurge has laid forth. Because theurgy, first and foremost, is demiurgy, participating in the demiurge by methexis through mesis, by mimicking him. So he says, to philosophize then is not to be a radical exception to the rule, to have some new idea, to try and make your mark. To philosophize is to do exactly what you came here to do, which is the most liberating thing because it's the most limiting thing. And we see echoes of that in like Aleister Crowley. Do find your true will, do only that, nothing else. That's a very Platonic idea, which speaks again to where do we see Plato in these modern traditions. Crowley's a great example. When you look at his text, it's very obscure these days, but in the OTO, we received a copy of Atlantis, a text called Atlantis, which is completely based around the Republic. It's Crowley's picture of the Republic for a thelemic group of people. But that idea that you're talking about, Ike, the further you get in progress, the less free will we have. And Castrum, Bernardo Castrum, you familiar with him? Philosopher. Recently wrote a book on the daemon, but one of the points he makes is that really the closer we get to embodying our daemon, the less free will we really have, because it's all about a surrender to the daemon. And we could say, well, I'm not going to do what the daemon has set forth for me. I'm going to pretend that I have free will and do something else. You still do what the daemon has set forth for you. The question is, do I surrender and surf on this tidal wave, or do I get crushed by the tidal wave and still go that fucking direction? Because that's where the chips fall, where the daemons say they fall. And the daemons say where they fall based on what the gods have already decreed is the nature of reality. This is truth, right? So the further we get in the direction of our daemon, and especially of the head of our chain, of our Syrah, free will is non-existent.
Yeah. The only free will that we attain here is freedom from the illusion that we are the body. And then we move up and dedicate ourselves. And that's interesting too, because the Iamblichus talks about the punishing daemon, which is like there are, these are meant to, these are spirits that are meant to sort of smack your hand or smack your face, if give you a little bit of punishment.
They also contain, like he mentions that their job is to keep us from spilling out of ourselves, right? And if man has to occupy this segment in the hierarchy of being, or there's a gap, there's no continuation of the flow, right? So if I want to ascend, like Iamblichus says, first I need to be making offerings to my daemon, and then hopefully eventually to the God. But that punishing daemon, it's punishing because it won't take its hand off of us, saying you're going to be contained in this form, in this life. It's like a parent holding a kid down. That it's punishing, but it's also containing, so that the universe doesn't fall apart because there's a gaping black hole where I should be.
Yeah. And that's an important point, I think, for a lot of people that are interested in some of the things that we're interested in, because that idea of punishment / containment to our society feels oppressive, when really it's like in my life's experience, I mean, a lot of times punishment and containment was an ultimate mercy. It was an ultimate benevolence, right? Because it gets you to sort of, straighten out and fly right type of situation.
There is no love without correction. It's an old adage.
I like that.
That's true. Yep. And when you have kids, you definitely definitely know the importance of containment.
Yes.
What could really be better than living aligned anyway?
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else is basically that existential dissonance,
Right.
That's right.
which is not comfortable at all. But I think, and this is just me, right? Because I'm a little outspoken about things, but I think we've normalized that dissonance.
Not you, Ike.
Yes.
That's that existential state of discomfort.
In music and art and media, you just see it consistently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you
It's
guys
been-
are all
it's been
beautiful.
encouraged.
Yeah.
Everybody here is beautiful.
Yeah.
I agree. This has been a great group.
Oh yeah, that was pretty good, man. Unfortunately, we do have people that need to leave too, so
Yeah.
I'm just gonna have to wrap it up here.
Time is
Kids
and we
calling at my door.
didn't even get to talk about Atlantis.
Yeah,
That's okay.
We'll leave that up to,
I know.
We'll leave that up to Graham Hancock and
you know what?
and our buddy Randall Carlson.
You know what? At first, I was actually going to be like, but I was like, I don't want to, be a fascist or censor. But I did want to even say I didn't even want to touch Atlantis. To be totally honest with you, because you're going to get people fucking bitching and arguing about stuff that's stupid, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, that's the best way to get people in the peanut gallery start ringing their bells.
Oh yeah.
Athens defeated Atlantis, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
All right.
That's why it's saying.
Well, the thing is too, a lot of, and I'll just say this, orienting it in a Platonic context, the Timaeus, which is where it's mentioned, is Socrates has traveled to the Piraeus, which is the port for these Athenian games. The other dialogue where that happens is the Republic. So it is typically thought, even though we don't have the definitive connective tissue historically, it's typically thought that the Timaeus is the next day. And you even have the same interlocutors with one missing, right? Socrates says, "I see the three. Where's the fourth?" One of the guys is missing. So he just talked about the right way to govern the polis and the internal polis, and now we're looking at Atlantis, which is the dark twin of the Republic, which is like, this is how you fuck up,
destroy a society or yourself.
And also aliens and Bigfoot and all that shit. They were all there with the Muppets. They were all on Atlantis.
Yeah, synthetic Merkabahs and chimeras.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you very much, both of you guys. Let me start off with Brandon real quick, because I know he's got to leave, and then so does Judith. Brandon, please let everybody know what's up with you and where they can find all your amazing work, sir.
Thank you, Nick. Cardinal Electric Head. Thank you, Ike, and thank you, PD Newman. Thank you. It's wonderful to meet you, PD. This is fantastic. I've been reading through your book. It's on my nightstand. It's amazing, and I tell everybody to read it. I've posted it on my Instagram as well and X. So I am an avid pusher of your documentation. So again, thank you for showing up, and I'd love to chat with you more another day. Everyone, like I always say, thank you to the Occult Rejects for all things. Head over to Magus in the Media, where we break down myth, magic, and meaning in the stories that we love. The world is wild, aliens are real, and reality is bending in its Epstein strings. Let's make sure we understand the meaning within the soul with stories like this, and the media that is breaking its stranglehold on our consciousness. Please like, subscribe, and share, not only to my channel, but everyone here. Buy all their things, and make sure you know that no matter what happens out in reality, it's not the true reality. We stem from the mind. Thank you again, Nick, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Of course. Thank you for joining us, Brandon. Awesome. And Judith, the loon, what is going on?
Yes. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Ike and PD. You put a different perspective on Plato for me, which I didn't even fathom. So I thank you for that. You could find me on YouTube and on X as the Loon. I almost said Twitter there, as the Loon, and just feel free to drop by and join our conversations there. Thank you again.
Of course. No, thank you, Judith. And Jules, my man, what is going on?
Oh, this was a great show. Learned a lot. Maybe a little too much, man. I have a lot of questions myself, but I didn't feel the need to ask them right now. So maybe we can do it. I'm sure I'll see you guys on another episode. It was really good meeting y'all, though. Gray Pilled Pod on Twitter. We may be streaming later. I don't know. Brandon will be on my show soon, hopefully this next week or so. Greyhorn Pagan's coming on, Veritas Road, and Aeon Bite, and a few other people I think I have getting scheduled. So this was a banger, and like I said, I didn't know anything about Plato, hardly anything before this, so it's good to know where a lot of these ideas come from. And I think it is important for people to focus on their spirit. Someone had mentioned earlier, people kind of focus on, or maybe it was this morning even, they focus on the afterlife. They kind of don't focus on here and now and doing the work that can help you ascend to that final level. And so I think it's important to have these conversations and to get that information out there. So thank you guys for coming on. And it's good to see all my fellow rejects again.
Oh, yeah.
As always.
Thank you, Jules.
Yeah.
And Robbie Marks, what is up?
Yeah, this was a great talk. It was great to meet you, Ike, and always good to hang out, PD. It's just some beautiful stuff to get into these ideas, As far as myself, I'm Robbie or R Marks, and I'm an artist, illustrator. And if you want to check out my other stuff, I have my Meta Mindcast podcast, as well as all my artwork. You can go to my website. All my links you can find at my Linktree, which are Linktree RMARX. And always a pleasure, Nick. Thanks for getting me out of the little hermit hole I'm in.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on, man. Thank you, appreciate it. And Eros, what is up, Eros?
Hello, this was great. I learned so much. I really especially liked all the biblical history. A lot of that I didn't know. So this was great. Thanks for coming on and having this discussion with us. And it was great to hang out with all of you rejects again. You can find me on YouTube at Aerosup. I post a lot about Plotinus and chaos and order and multiplicity and all sorts of things. So definitely go check that out if you're interested. And then you can find me at Eros to Ethos on X as well.
Thank you very much, Eros. And Ethan, sir.
Well, thank you, everyone. Ike, PD, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom, and everyone. Always appreciate communicating with you guys. Ethan Indigo Smith on all the social media, YouTube even, and I'm easy to find, and appreciate everyone's communication if they decide to reach out.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Appreciate it. And Ike, please let everybody know where they can find all your amazing work.
IkeBaker.com, IKEBAKER. I'll put that in the chat. You can check me out there. I've got my the latest YouTube video. I do documentary style presentations on the history, theory, and practice of the Western esoteric traditions. A bunch of it's Platonic. The last one I did actually was a while ago, but it's basically an introduction to theurgic Neoplatonism. I've got the latest 3 episodes of my podcast that you can stream from there. You can read my blog, find out a little bit more about what it is I do. I give quarterly group classes that are open to the public at an extremely, somebody has said fair rate, but it's not really fair to me, but it's fair to everyone else. Yeah, so you can check that out if you're interested. I have a newsletter that goes out just about every Thursday, and it's completely free. You can sign up for it there. And then also check out the Arcanum podcast. I put that in the chat as well. And again, I cannot understate how much I respect you, PD, and how much I think you are contributing to the dialogue here in ways that are unprecedented, and I think will influence the way we go forward in the future with these subjects, which, as you know, they're close to my heart. So, and therefore, so are you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I've had so much fun these past what we've been doing this for 2.5 hours, more than that.
Yeah, almost 3 now.
Yeah, this has been great. So thank you all for having me. What I've got coming up, my partner in crime, Alec Hawkins, and we are wrapping up a documentary that we've been working on for the last 3 years that traces the trajectory of a certain tradition of alchemy from late antiquity into the Enlightenment. Hopefully that will be done in April, and we'll start putting it in some film festivals and then release it properly. We're in talks with a couple of different streamers. And beyond that, I will be speaking at the Anthropology of Consciousness conference. It's happening in Las Vegas from March 29th to April 1st. And I will be asking the question, is AI the new LSD? And you might be surprised by my answer. So if any of y'all are in the Las Vegas area, come see me.
Awesome. Very interesting on that idea. Thank you both very much. Ike, PD, that was an amazing episode. Thank you all to the rejects. Again, hopefully maybe one day in the future we can continue this talk on more of his other stuff. But I think that was
if you ever make your way up to Jackson, I'll be sure to buy you a beer, man. So
I'll be there.
Follow me, dude. Yeah.
I'll be there.
Nice. But yeah, again, I thought this was amazing, and I can't really, I don't want to kind of reiterate what Ike says, but I do think having these discussions and having you guys on and talk about this stuff really helps a lot for us to understand, like maybe where some of our ideas are coming from. This was an amazing show. I really can't thank you guys enough, and all the rejects and everybody in the chat. That's what's up. I appreciate it. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.